Okay, thank you very much. And especially because part of my title is Victor Hugo and you, I am very glad to see so many people here whom I know, and of course others whom I will know in the future. And I was thinking about the end of Cyrano, when as he's dying, he's striking out at all of his old enemies. Well, if I could, I would wish to hug all of my friends. So thank you for coming. And I'm here, I'm going to talk about an hour, and then with time for Q&A. And of course, I'll be talking about Victor Hugo. So welcome to his universe. Now, he was a man who lived more than 80 years, and as far as I can tell, he made good use of all of that time, every minute of it. So I'm going to try to do that too. And over the years, people have said many things about him. And right now, I want to give you the words of Mario Vargas Llosa, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2010. And this is what he said, quote, "Victor Hugo has generated across 5 continents more literary studies, philological analyses, critical editions, biographies, translations, and adaptations of his work than any other Western author, with the single exception of William Shakespeare." So lots written about Victor Hugo. Here's my plan for what I'm going to do with you in our time together. I'm going to start by giving you the big picture, an overall view of his career and achievement. And then I'm going to take you to some highlights of his career and some low points in his life. And if I leave out something that's of interest to you, you may ask me afterwards or tell me about it yourself. And I'm going to try to convey some of the special experience that you would find in his writing if there are elements in it you haven't explored yet. Then I'm going to talk about his impact and about some of the writers who admired him and others who disparaged him. And in the end, I will tell you as he begins with the invitation to you. So, some of you have heard me say this before, but it's always true. My role in talking about literature is similar to the role identified by Kent Lansing in The Fountainhead. He was talking with Howard Rourke about Austin Heller, a crusading journalist. And Kent said, "Someone had to tell them. It takes 2 to make a very great career. A man who was great and the man almost rare who was great enough to see greatness and say so." Now, I'm not making Hugo's very great career. Fortunately, he's had a lot of people discerning his merits. But I do see greatness and say so. And I suspect that some of you maybe have told me you've not yet gotten to know enough of the writings of Victor Hugo. So I think someone has to tell you. And that's why I'm here. So today I'm here to be Hugo's Austin Heller. And my hope is that you too, in your reading of Hugo, will see greatness, say so, and tell other people, spread the word. So the big picture. He is acknowledged as the greatest poet in French literature. Even critics who do not admire him or enjoy him cannot ignore or minimize the achievement of his volumes of verse. Someone was once asked, who's the greatest poet in French literature? It was André Gide, and he said, Victor Hugo, hélas. Alas, it's Victor Hugo. He had to admit that he was the greatest poet. Hugo is also the author of 5 major novels: Notre Dame of Paris, Les Miserables, Toilers of the Sea, The Man Who Laughs, and 93. And he's the author of several plays, including Hernani and Ruy Blas and The King Amuses Himself. As you may see if you read his plays, you'll see that he was an inventive and colorful playwright without whom French drama, not to mention Italian opera, would be the poorer. So he's the great triple threat. We've got the poems, we've got the prose, and we've got the plays. But that's not all. It's not even all for the P's. He was also a public figure. He was a politician who served in the National Assembly. He was a polemicist who campaigned for causes he considered crucial. He was a patriot, in love with the French nation, and even though, or even because, he loved France, he spent 20 years abroad in exile. First, because the regime would not have him, and then, even though he would have been allowed to come back, he decided that he could not abide them. Okay, after he did come back, he was there for some years, he died. There were 1 million people at his funeral, and his death was the subject of headlines for 2 weeks. So that's, Victor Hugo, all the P's and the plays, the polemics, the poems, the prose, the patriot. But who was he in his own eyes? Well, to begin with, He was a writer who thought of himself as a writer for a specific time and also as a writer for all time. And part of that was because he didn't live in an ivory tower. He concerned himself with issues that were urgent in his own day. But these issues were not ones that he handled in a narrow, petty, concrete way, but in the light of the big, broad subjects that any writer would want to write about. He was always hunting big game. So you look at his poems and you see a variety of themes. Some of them have particular dates for particular events, but they're always related to bigger themes: passion and liberty, love and loss, suffering, and the aspiration for justice. Now, his plays seem to have one, as far as I see it, one main theme: action in the face of unbearable conflicts. The chief theme of his novels is that human beings can be great in spite of all the odds and all the obstacles. And what he does, it's his brilliance, is he piles on the obstacles, and then he shows us how human beings can nonetheless shine brightly. He was a universal writer, so a writer for his time, but also a writer for all time. He's on fire with good and evil, with struggle, with success, with the grandeur of the spirit and the glory of the possibility of being better today than yesterday. Those issues are always with us, and they never get old. As Hugo wrote, and as you may remember, Ayn Rand quoted in the intro to the 1968 edition of The Fountainhead, "If a writer wrote only for his own time, I would have to break my pen and throw it away." Well, he didn't do that. He didn't have to do that, but he did write for his time and for all time, not only for his time. Also, he thought of himself as a writer for specific readers, but also for all readers. He said he was writing for specific readers, the ones who think, who are mentally active, who would open their eyes and their spirits to his dramatic visions of events and emotions that matter. In a draft of the preface for The Man Who Laughs, he wrote, "There's no reader except the thinking reader. It is to him that I've dedicated my work." But he also said that his novels were intended for all readers, without restriction. He was writing for all nations, all classes, all backgrounds. The publisher of the Italian translation of Les Miserables, wondered, what is this going to have to say to Italians? He said, "I don't know whether it will be read by all, but I wrote it for everyone. I wrote it for everyone." And David Bellows, who's written what I think is a wonderful book about Les Miserables, novel of the century, and David Bellows says, quote, "It did not occur to him that a masterpiece could not be a blockbuster too, and he saw no reason why everyone should not be served the same fare as literary connoisseurs." Well, Ayn Rand thought that too, right? Why can't a masterpiece and a blockbuster be the same book? And Victor Hugo said, "The book, my book, all my books, knocks on the door and says, 'Open up, I've come for you.'" He believed that all people, whatever their origins or situations, could and should be his kind of reader. They could all be readers who think when they read. So when he wrote, he invited readers to join him on the heights, to meet him on his mountains. Wherever you are, whenever you are, whoever you are, when you open one of his books, it's time to rise. And that's the invitation. Well, there's a lot of rising to do because there are a lot of books. Over 20,000 pages of text, not to mention 3,000 works of visual art. Well, for some artists, less is more. For Victor Hugo, more is more. Okay, you can just hear him saying, "I want more. I will give you more poems, more pictures, more plots, more to see and more to say." And that was indeed his spirit. The Blackmores, who translated into English a fair number of his poems, they commented, quote, "No matter how much he had achieved, no matter how much he had done already, he still had to go beyond. He still had to go further. Another artist may eventually reach a point where he can sit back and say, 'This is the best of me. I can't jump further.' Hugo could never reach that point. He was always trying to jump further. No limit, no boundary, no resting place could ever satisfy him," unquote. So, if he's always writing more, does that mean that the reader is entitled to pick and choose? Well, we do have to, but he didn't want us to. He wanted us to read everything. He said that his writings together constitute a whole. And he said, publishers who will abridge my work under the pretext of offering selections will be, I tell them so in advance, imbeciles. Okay. He also said, what would you think of a man who came back from the mountain with a pebble in his hand and said to you, here is Mont Blanc? Okay, he said the pebble's the mountain. He told his heirs, any selection from a human mind is a diminishment. A eunuch is a man from whom someone has made a selection. Okay, unquote. That's my translation, but that's what he said. All right, well, so here I am, the imbecile, and I do have to select, at least in what I'm telling you today, but I am going to try to emphasize what's most important, and I've already tried to give you a sense of who he is in the most important way. And now that I'm going to be moving to his life, the most important thing I can tell you about his life is that it was his life. It was his chosen life. It was his shaped life, that he was fundamentally in charge. And Mario Vargas Llosa, the Nobel Prize winner I mentioned a minute ago, writes, quote, if something stands out in this multifaceted life of a man who was a poet, a novelist, a journalist, a politician, an academic, a family man, a designer, a teacher, an artist, and a conscience of his society, it is that fate seems to have played a very small part in an existence shaped by determination, dedication, discipline, self-confidence, ambition, and of course, an extraordinary flair for the French language. And this is still Mario Vargas Llosa. Victor Hugo is one of those men who, it seems, bring fate to heel. His character and determination appear so strong that he can overcome and use in his favor all the obstacles that chance might place in his way, turning adversity to his advantage, which is, of course, what many of his characters do. And Vargas Llosa says, one example, instead of depressing him and causing his political demise, his long exile in Belgium, Jersey, and Guernsey enabled him to write his most ambitious books, close quote. So the big picture is that Victor Hugo, by an act of will, and for him all art was an act of will, made himself a voice that could not be silenced, and a victor, that's even his name, who could not be vanquished. As the poet Paul Valéry commented, the problem in the 19th century was not how to be greater than Victor Hugo, but how to be anything or anyone when Victor Hugo was alive and at his desk. He was the century, and I think it didn't end with his century. So now we're going to go through his life, selecting. And his life begins with conflicts. He was the third son of an incompatible couple who spent their rare time together quarreling. They were incompatible on political grounds, opposite sides. Sophie was a royalist, and Léopold Sigisbert, a career military officer, he was on the other side. He was very pro-Napoleon. They were incompatible on other grounds as well, and eventually divorced, which was relatively rare at that time. Well, he learned from both of them. He lived for some time with both of them, and he turned everything into writing. He was a precocious writer, and conflicts were always part of that. As a precocious writer, he won early acclaim. Before his early 20s, he completed 2 novels and 10 volumes of poetry. His early writing was vivid and passionate in its imagery, with what became his trademark, the colorful antithesis, so the conflict in 2 words. And he was very ambitious. As a teenager, he wrote a review of a novel by Sir Walter Scott called Quentin Durward, and in it he set forth his goal. And he said, after the picturesque but prosaic novel of Walter Scott, there remains another novel to be created, more beautiful and still more complete. This novel is at once drama and epic. It is picturesque, but also poetic. It is real, but also ideal. It is true, but also grand. And he soon took up that task. A few years later, he wrote in a preface to his play Cromwell, the multiple objective of art is to open for the viewer a double horizon, to illuminate at the same time the interior and the exterior of man. Well, that covers everything, right? To bring together in a word, the same scene, the drama of life and the drama of conscience or consciousness. So he wanted to do everything, and he wanted to do everything at once. And he wanted it from the time he was very young. He was an early bloomer also in the area of romance. He was in love with another teenager, Adèle Fouché, the girl next door, a warm young woman who was devoted to him as well. They exchanged passionate letters and passionate kisses. They married in 1822, and you do the math, 1802 he's born, so he's still quite young. They married in 1822 after the death of his mother, who had disapproved of their union because she wanted her brilliant son to marry a woman of higher social standing. Well, he didn't want to marry some abstract woman of higher social standing. He wanted to marry Adèle, okay? Now, Victor's brother Eugène also disapproved of the union, but for a different reason. He was in love with Adèle. So this was something that was part of Hugo's experience early, someone suffering from passionate, unrequited love. On the day of the wedding, brother Eugène had a breakdown, and he never quite recovered. He spent most of the remainder of his life in a mental institution. Okay. In the fall of 1829, we're moving on, and the winter of 1830, we've gone on now several years, Victor Hugo now has two crises. One of them has to do with the romance. Adèle, who was pregnant with her fifth child in 8 years, made it clear that she wanted no more children. And there was only one sure way to achieve that. Okay? The second crisis was that he rushed through the writing of his play Hernani, which he knew was going to be shocking, but he wanted to get it done. He knew that he was going to offend the classicists. He knew he was going to offend the censors, but he really wanted to both revolutionize art and to support his family and maybe, create some peace at home. Well, things got worse before they got better. The crisis with Adèle was made worse when his best friend, the critic Sainte-Beuve, began a romance with her, a secretive and intimate relationship that lasted 6 years. And, by the nature of things, we don't have an enormous number of direct details, but we know something of how Sainte-Beuve wrote about it and how Hugo wrote about it and what Adèle felt about it. Hugo wrote to his friend, "I do not know where I am with the two beings I love best in the world. You are one of them." He told Adèle that she was free to choose. She chose her husband. But after this time, his marriage with Adèle became more of a friendship, and his friendship with Sainte-Beuve became less of a friendship. And Sainte-Beuve, who'd been writing warm reviews, the reviews became less enthusiastic. And I don't believe he did this, but Sainte-Beuve actually wrote 2 novels dealing with the relationship. And, Ramacle, and then the other one, he actually used Adèle's name. So he's not on my good list, Sainte-Beuve, but of course, people are, it's always been a mystery exactly what was going on with Adèle, but what we do know is that Victor Hugo was torn by it, and it made an enormous difference. However, he did write Hernani, and he saw it performed, and this was the next adventure. The play was shocking in content and in style. It was shocking in content because it mixed the exalted and the everyday world, and it was shocking in style because the lines didn't match the conventional verse. In other words, he wasn't staying, so to speak, within the lines. And from the standpoint of the characters, he has a hero who's an outlaw and whose rivals for the love of a noble woman are the king himself and the woman's own uncle. Well, there were fights every night and not just on stage. The classicists and the romanticists were fighting with each other, and the episode was even called, the Battle of Hernani. So this was, when the theater becomes as fraught as the political scene, that means, in a sense, that art has taken center stage in the culture. And he didn't quit being controversial and brilliant. The plays that followed, including Ruy Blas and The King Amuses Himself, also portrayed commoners as superior to royalty in skill and in morals. Those were the stories he wanted to tell. And whatever the name and nationality of the king involved in the play, he didn't say it's our king, he didn't say it was France, but it was a king, he managed to arouse the anger of the ruling class. And he's getting into trouble with the censors. And thus, after the repeated experience of seeing his dramas censored and shut down, he continued to pour out poetry, but for his storytelling, he turned mainly to the novel, which he said is the theater that's never closed. Yeah, the king can't shut that down. His first great novel, which was published in between some of his plays, was Notre de Paris. He wrote it under time pressure, he wrote it under financial pressure, and I think he wrote it under a certain kind of emotional pressure as well. The setting was the Cathedral of Notre Dame in 1482. And it has, you might say, many coexisting identities. It is a love story. It's a story about a young woman loved by a shallow, conventional young soldier, an obsessed, stern priest, and Quasimodo, a deaf hunchback. And it's a portrait of medieval Paris. And most significantly for me, it's an evocation of the difference between meaning and meaninglessness, of what it means for something to have meaning, to be a sacred value. And it's a tribute to the power of literature, to words that can travel everywhere on wings of print, as opposed to the weight of an unmoving cathedral. And it was a crusade for the cathedral itself, which was in disrepair in 1831 and in danger of destruction. Well, the novel was a big hit. It made him famous in France. It made, not just as a poet, it made him famous all over the world, far beyond France. And within France, it helped save that cathedral. And as we watched it burn in April this year, some of us remembered Hugo's words about the cathedral as a setting of sacred value and significance. I would love to talk more about the novel. I've done a conference course on it, but for now, I need to take you to the next crisis, which is on your handout. It's an actress. This happened after the time in the breach of his marriage, a time when Victor and Adele, at her request, had separate bedrooms, and he met an actress who was also a courtesan, who was known as Juliette Drouet. She sent him a note imploring him to visit her alone so that she could give herself to him entirely. Well, he did, and she did. Okay? She and Hugo formed, and this is how it began, but they formed an enduring relationship that lasted from 1833 to 1883. That's 50 years, right? And it was ended only when they were parted by her death. So when it began, the relationship in 1833, she left the stage, but she never left Victor Hugo. She wrote him, at his request, 20,000 letters. She copied his manuscripts. She traveled with him. She saved his life by hiding him when he offended the regime of Louis Napoleon. She accompanied him into exile on the Channel Islands. They never married, not even after the death of his wife in 1868. But I think that even from some of the clues in the books, we can see how he cherished her. He honored her by inscribing in Les Miserables the date of their first night together, February 16th, 1833, which in the novel is the wedding day of Marius and Cosette. He honored her in Toilers of the Sea with the name of the protagonist, Juliet, right? Juliet. Well, even if you don't hear it, she heard it, okay? He honored her in 93 with the name of the purest and strongest of the heroes. And the purest and strongest of the heroes is Gauvin, and that was her birth name, Juliette Gauvin. And so there she is. She was, moreover, with him at the time of one of the great crises of his life, which is painful to discuss, but I can't leave it out. And first, I'm going to read to you from my own free translation of one of his most famous poems from Les Contemplations, and it's Demain dès l'aube. And here's my English for part of it. Tomorrow at dawn, at the hour when the countryside grows bright, I will set out. I know, you see, that you await me. I will go by the forest. I will go by the mountain. I can no longer remain remote from you. I will not see the gold of falling evening or the sails receding in the distance. The speaker seems to be setting out for a reunion with his beloved. But the final lines of the poem, and when I arrive, I will place on your tomb a bouquet of green holly and of heather in bloom. So he's making a pilgrimage in his imagination to a grave. So who's in the grave? In this imagined grave, and there was a real grave, was his older daughter, Leopoldine. He had reluctantly allowed her at 18 to marry the man of her choice. Within a year, the newlyweds were dead. Leopoldine, who was pregnant, had drowned in a boat on the Seine, and her young husband had died trying to save her. Hugo learned the news while he was on a trip with Juliette. They were on vacation, and he happened to glance at a newspaper lying open on a cafe table. And he saw his name, and then he saw her name, and he couldn't believe it, but it was true. Can you imagine? He devoted many poems to the subject of Leopoldine. But I think from the one that I read you, he's going to visit her, but, it's the tomb. His beloved child was lost, but somehow still present, and he did write her into his art. There's the number thing. You know that Jean Valjean's first prison number was 24601? That's June 24th, 1801, which Hugo believed was the date he himself was conceived. And Jean Valjean's second prison number was for Leopoldine. That was 9430, which contains within it the numbers for September 4th, 1843. You have to use some of the numbers more than once. And that's the day of the death of Leopoldine. Now, one thing that's always sort of interested me is that Victor Hugo puts these little hints into his books, and I guess they were for him. They were for people who knew, and they're for those who came after. But in his own time, he made sure that it was going to be possible to figure out many private things about him. He left to France all of his manuscripts and all of his notes, including the journals in which he recorded the specific details of his romantic intimacies in a code that is not hard to decipher. Okay, so that's all left as a gift to the nation. Well, I've now talked about the three women who were dearest to him, Adele and Juliette and Leopoldine. So I'm going to go to his public life in the sense of politics and the way that it pervaded and interrupted his longest and most famous novel, Les Miserables. Now, if any of you felt the need to take a break while you were reading it, well, he took a big break, more than 10 years. And which is interesting, and yet he came back to it, and he was the same writer, and he did finish the book. He did put it aside when he was when his life took a different turn with the Revolution of 1848 and the coup of Louis Napoleon in 1851. And this was a time when he was still writing poems, but he was not writing Les Miserables. And then after he was in exile and he's on the Channel Island of Guernsey, he goes back to the book and he finishes it. And there's even the place in the manuscript where he says, this is where the peer of France laid down his pen, and this is where the exile took it up. Okay. Now, why did he interrupt the writing of the book? Why did he interrupt his life? Well, Victor Hugo was a passionate moralist, and he was an active figure in public life. He took sides in political issues. And I need to tell you that from my understanding, systematic philosophical consistency, not his strong suit, and thus I have some difficulty in trying to analyze coherently the reasons for the changes in his political views. But what I can tell you is that when he changed his mind, he changed his stance, he stood by his convictions, and of course he changed his address. What's fascinating is that when at the beginning of that time, you might have thought of him as being a traditionalist, a conservative, maybe more like his mother. When he first started thinking of Les Miserables, he was a peer for life, having been granted that honor by King Louis Philippe. He'd been elected to the National Assembly as a conservative. He was not the enemy of royalty or of the regime. He even made a visit to some barricades in 1848 to advise the insurgents to surrender, and he encouraged the military officers who were suppressing the workers' revolt to keep up the good work. He supported for president Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the first Napoleon, probably because he thought that this man was going to try to do good for France. But as the years went on, his speeches changed. He became less enthusiastic about the regime and more insistent that he was an independent, not a party conformist. And the book that he was writing and the causes he was embracing came together. He spoke about undeserved suffering, and his goal was not to reduce it, but to end it. One of his speeches was called To Destroy Misery. And so you hear the destroy and you hear the misery, miserable. He's the public man and the writer are on the same page. And he's now voting with the liberals, and by July 1851, he condemned Louis Napoleon as Napoleon the Little. By contrast with Napoleon the Great, it's the kind of attack that sticks and stings. And then it got worse. Typical, as in Victor Hugo, those things get worse. On December 2nd, 1851, this Louis Napoleon dissolved the National Assembly, and by using the army, occupied the National Printing Office to subdue any dissent. Not good. A broadside was issued condemning this act and referring to this Napoleon as an outlaw. Now, several people were involved with this broadside, but there was only one name on there. And you know who it is. It's Victor Hugo. This was a dangerous time to claim authorship because blood was running in the streets and the army was crushing all protests. He later wrote a very moving poem, Memory of the Night of Four, meaning December 4th, and it was published in the collection Les Châtiments. It's a heartbreaking poem about an 8-year-old boy murdered by Napoleon's soldiers and mourned by the boy's grandmother. She says, "He was only 8. His teachers were content with him. When I had to write a letter, it was he who wrote it. Are they setting out to kill children now? He was playing this morning in front of the window. He is all I have of his mother. Why did they kill him? Someone explain it to me." Well, that's, a poem from that time. 26,000 French citizens were arrested, and Hugo could easily have been one of them. There was a price on his head, but Joliette hid him for several days, helped him escape in disguise to Brussels, packed up his manuscripts in a trunk, and followed him into exile. She saved his life, and she saved his manuscripts, including the unfinished manuscript of Les Miserables. And he spent most of the ensuing years on the Channel Island of Guernsey. Now, in 1859, he was offered amnesty, and 2/3 of the French exiles agreed to return, but he wasn't one of them. He said that liberty was in exile, and he would not return until liberty returned, which he believed it did with the Third Republic. But in his island home, there are pictures of him, kind of looking out at the sea and so on, but he was writing a lot. He wasn't just looking out at the sea. He wrote poem after poem. He completed Les Miserables, and I'm now going to tell you something about that book. It is a book that is just full of heroes. It brims with greatness, and greatness is greatness of the spirit, and that's something that we see in that book up close and personal. Maybe one of the most famous sequences, which I've always loved, is in Part 1, Book 7, Chapter 3, and this is his crisis of conscience. Hugo calls it, the tempest in a skull. Champmathieu, a simple man arrested for stealing apples, has been mistakenly identified as Jean Valjean, whom the law has been hunting because he's an ex-con and he stole a coin from a child and then broke parole. So if Jean Valjean remains silent, he will be able to continue as the respected mayor, and Champmathieu will suffer life imprisonment. But if Jean Valjean admits his identity, he'll be a convict again. He'll be locked up. And at first, he tries to distract himself from the decision by eating and sleeping, but then he begins to think, to define himself through the proper use of his mind. He questions. He hesitates. But he will not run away from the responsibility to face the facts, including the painful facts. After a few moments, he returned to this somber dialogue in which it was he who spoke and he who listened, saying what he wished to stifle, listening to what he did not wish to hear, because it's hard, yielding to the mysterious power that said to him, think. It's weird. It's almost, as if he hears a voice from the beyond in it, but it's telling him to think, which means, back to reality. Jean Valjean, upon recognizing that he needs to think, realizes that if the goal of his life is to be an honest man, the only way to avoid now being a criminal in spirit is to become once again a convict in chains. So he's thought his way through to the correct moral identification and can act morally. So that's one of his big scenes. And then, of course, from the novel, you probably know, I was told not to make this specifically focused to objectivist, but I thought it would be okay to mention Ayn Rand every so often, especially since he's, a writer she esteems so much, and she had a favorite character, Enjolras. She fell in love with him, she said. He's the leader of the young revolutionaries. He's described as a severe young man, is Hugo's language, executioner and priest, luminous like the crystal and rock also. He's described as having a disdainful lower lip and hair flying in the wind. Does this sound familiar? Okay. Executioner and priest. Okay. In the opening pages of The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand introduces her hero's face with a contemptuous mouth, shut tight, the mouth of an executioner or a saint. He's standing on a rock, and the wind waved his hair against the sky. Right. Now, Enjolras also is not just someone you look at, but someone you hear. Here's his voice in a scene where he's inspiring his revolutionary comrades. He says, "Citizens, the 19th century is great, but the 20th century will be happy." Right? We wish, right? Man will be happy. Friends, this hour we are living in, and in which I am speaking to you, is a somber one, but such is the terrible price of the future. A revolution is a toll gate. The human race will be delivered, uplifted, and consoled. We are affirming it on this barricade. Oh, my brothers, this barricade is made neither of paving stones, nor of timbers, nor of iron. It is made of two mounds, a mound of ideas and a mound of sorrows. So what he does is that he's making of these men who were diverse. We've met them before. They're very different from each other, but he makes them not a mass or a unit, but individuals unified by purpose, with a struggle that ennobles them. They're not surrendering themselves to the cause, but their cause is giving a value to them. And he tells them, brothers, whoever dies here dies in the radiance of the future, and we are entering a grave illuminated by the dawn. And maybe that might remind some of you of a line from Atlas Shrugged. Should you die without reaching full sunlight, you will die on a level touched by its rays. And here's something else from Les Miserables. I can't tell you about the whole book, but I'll tell you some of my favorites. And this one is an Ayn Rand favorite too. Grantaire, who is an unlikely friend for the idealistic Enjolras. We're told that Grantaire's moral spine leaned on that firmness of Enjolras. He admires him without quite understanding why. And his admiration, Grantaire's admiration for Enjolras, has parallels with Gail Winand's admiration for Rourke in The Fountainhead. Because, as you probably remember, Winand believes that his friendship with Rourke enables him to regain his best self. And Rourke becomes the person who means most to him on earth. Ayn Rand commented that one scene with Enjolras was actually the Winand-Rourke in spirit. And I think this is the death scene, which she said was her personal highlight in the novel. And the fact that Grantaire, in that scene in Les Miserables, has slept through the struggle, and he awakens from his alcoholic stupor and immediately understands everything that's been going on. Okay, he sees Enjolras on the point of being shot and asks permission to join him. And this is the Winand-Rourke in spirit, that it's not too late for the two to join hands and minds, the lesser man and the man who inspired him. And you see, for the readers, that's the same invitation. You too can join hands with Enjolras and not just in death. Or, if we're looking for greatness, it also comes in the pint size. Gavroche, right? Gavroche, who is the disowned son of the Thénardiers, the novel's villains, lives by his wits on the street. One day, he comes across two boys younger than he who are new to the street. They too have no one to take care of them. He shelters them in the Elephant of the Bastille, a plaster statue conceived and initiated by Napoleon, and he gets some bread and he shares his bread with them, giving them food he could well have craved. Tears off some bread. Eat that, he says. Put that in your gun, by which, in his slang, he means your mouth. He doesn't know that they're actually his brothers, disowned as he has been disowned. Now, Hugo doesn't forget about this. Many chapters later, when real guns have gone off at the barricades on the other side of town, those two little boys are in the Luxembourg garden, and they see a wealthy father and his son throwing into the water some bread they do not want. Now, there are some swans in the garden, and they go running after the bread, but the older of the two boys races the swans for the bread. He reaches it. He divides it in two, and not two even parts, and he gives the larger part to his little brother. Put that in your gun, he says. Okay? He's learned from Gavroche, and the reader maybe has learned as well. And if we think about it afterwards, maybe we remember how we got into this book to begin with, because how was it that Jean Valjean ended up in prison? He stole bread, for his sister's family. So they're all related, even the ones that are not related by blood. Now, if we have greatness in Les Miserables, we also have great evil. And I'm not talking about Javert, who is the persistent man of the law in pursuit of Jean Valjean, and he's the antagonist, but the true villains are the Thénardiers, who have guilt for the degradation of Fantine, for the abuse of her daughter Cosette, and this is the way that Hugo describes them. Souls that, crab-like, crawl continually toward darkness, going backward in life rather than advancing, using their experience to increase their deformity, growing continually worse, and becoming steeped more and more thoroughly in an intensifying viciousness. Okay? The way the good people get better and better, and these bad people get worse and worse. Hugo tells us that they hate the human race. Thénardier is a monster, aflame with rage and resentment, and he's ready to berate those he considers to be unjustly more fortunate than himself. And there's an interesting passage, because sometimes people think, the cliche is that, to love the poor, to hate the rich. Well, he's someone who hates the rich, but he's the villain. And he makes a whole speech about how horrible those rich people are. Thénardier contrasts his grinding poverty with the comfortable circumstances of the rich, and he says, "We will eat you. We will devour you," as if you don't deserve to live. It does not exactly make you sympathetic with the idea of soaking the rich, and Hugo gives those lines to his villain. So it's a long book, but it's got a single thread. It's a man who struggles in thought and action to regain and confirm his soul's goodness within a society in which justice itself is at risk. And here I'll just mention, the theme of justice is obviously important. It has to do with the law. But the first part of the book, the part that we start with about the bishop, that part is called Le Juste, the just man. So that's his cardinal virtue, is justice rather than what you might have thought. It's not about religion. Okay, so that's our book. It's struggle, soul's goodness, justice at risk. Well, some critics, whom we don't like, objected to its structure, style, and characterization, but readers were greedy for it. And I like this story too. The novel was it's a true story. The novel was an immediate bestseller. It was published in 3 parts. And if you want to read it in 3 parts, that's okay. Part 1 would be part 1, and then parts 2 and 3 together would be the second part, and then parts 4 and 5 together would be the third part. Well, part 1 is released in Belgium on March 30th, 1862, and 4 days later in Paris, Milan, Naples, London, St. Petersburg, and others. The first print run of part 1 sold out right away, and more copies were ordered. For the next installment, they were ready, and the number of copies was doubled, but that wasn't going to be enough either. One bookstore opens its doors at 6:40 a.m. on May 15th because it was just getting too hard to wait. The crowd had been outside for an hour by then, with wheelbarrows and handcarts to take away books, seemingly prepared to enter by force. Guess you could get in with the wheelbarrows if the books didn't come out. And the bookseller had put all of his other books into storage in order to make room for so many volumes of Les Miserables. And he said, there were so many books here, we could have formed a barricade all by ourselves. And, he was afraid the floor was going to collapse with all those books. The publication of the novel was the biggest story in town. Now, Hugo himself, he's on his island. He's not there. But his wife, who was not officially exiled, was on the scene in Paris, and she reported to him on how things were going. She told him that workers were combining their spare cash to purchase a single copy, which they read in turns, drawing lots at the end to see who would be allowed to own the book. And the faces of the characters were on all the shop windows. And so the book was beloved, it was sought after, made him world famous, and I think largely because of that, he's remained world famous and in some unusual places. A Vietnamese religion made him a saint and used some of his poems for its prayers. You can look it up. Okay, so that's Les Miserables. His next novel was also great, but very different. It's Toilers of the Sea, And in contrast with the multiple plots of Les Miserables, and with all those characters, several of them with many different names, we've got one hero with one name, a man of strength, skill, courage, and fortitude. Carpenter, blacksmith, sailor, and engineer, Gilliatt is invincible in body and spirit. There is vivid detail, Gilliatt's battles against physical forces and other forces, right? The whirlpool of the sea, the howl of the hurricane, the roughness of the rocks, the weight of machinery, the tenacity of the devilfish, the octopus, all the while fighting hunger, fatigue, and despair. And Hugo spends a lot of concentrated time on his hero's demonstrated ability. Now, his quest is also interesting. He's putting all of his virtues and skills to work to salvage a human achievement, an engine on a steamship, from natural disaster. There was a reef on which it had been wrecked. Well, once he sets out to rescue that engine, in the hope of winning the woman he loves, he's been given the idea that he'll get her if he saves this engine, the novel becomes the record of a man's triumph over insuperable obstacles, one after another. And everything, all of his tools and his boat, they're all his. And every new challenge tests his resilience, his ingenuity, his endurance. And Hugo characterizes his hero's victory as a result of moral force. So it's not just physical, it's moral force. You may have heard that Thomas Edison, who was a fan of Victor Hugo, was known by his friends as Thomas Victor Hugo Edison, or for short, Victor Hugo Edison. And he's said to have found special inspiration in Toilers of the Sea, and is not alone. So, 2 of the chapters are about, you might say, the villain, and it's an interesting sort of villain, the devilfish, as the perfection of evil, the treason of creation against herself, I'm quoting, a perverted intelligence, an embodiment of the riddle of the existence of evil. So the question is, why is an octopus more evil than other natural enemies? As Hugo describes the devilfish, it seems that his particular resentment is that it's got no identity except for pretending to be other things. It's a parasite, and it destroys the good by being a vacuum that engulfs, absorbs, and drains its victims. So in fighting for the devilfish, Gilliatt is fighting for values, for goodness, for honor, for intelligence, for everything that rebels against losing himself to a soft, strong, formless vacuum. And in giving Gilliatt this devilfish to fight, Hugo was coming up with the best dramatic, physical, and moral challenge he could. In this context, it is completely irrelevant to observe, as some contemporary readers did, that there are, in fact, not very many devilfish near Guernsey or Sark. Oh well, but the truth of the matter from Hugo's standpoint is he wanted this fish as the enemy, and it's a symbol, and he describes the battle. And so in the pages of Toilers of the Sea, it happened. And wherever the hero sets out to protect the good from the evil, they're a devilfish to be slain. So Victor Hugo is fulfilling the goal he announced in Les Miserables, to write the poem of the human consciousness, if only of one man, would be to swallow up all epics in a superior and definitive epic, which is what he does here, celebrating his hero in the act of greatness. So yes, read it. Next novel, Man Who Laughs. Brilliantly original story set in the England in the time of King James II and Queen Anne. For this novel, he adapted the notion of a trade consisting of mutilating physically healthy bodies, and he invented for this trade a Spanish name, the comprachicos, meaning child buyers. You might remember that Ayn Rand uses the comprachicos in an essay by that name as a metaphor for progressive education. Now, Gwynplaine, the protagonist, has been mutilated, with a laugh, by the order of the king, as an act of revenge against Gwynplaine's father, Lord Clancharlie, a rebel and an exile. We know exiles, right? The boy survives abandonment. He rescues at the age of 10 a helpless baby girl, and then he lives and makes his living with her and a troupe of traveling players. Now this is, as Hugo described his writing, a drama beyond ordinary proportions. This is not history. And it's exciting, it's gripping, from the struggle against the snowstorm to the moment when Gwynplaine, having learned the truth about his disfigurement, confronts and proclaims that truth of who he is and what it means in the most public possible setting, the British Parliament, the House of Lords, where he is entitled to take his place. And again, Hugo has had experience of speaking in a public place, although he didn't have a laugh to control, but maybe he had other things to control. But here's Gwynplaine talking about himself, and he's his own visual aid. If Satan had this laugh, it would condemn God. England is one acclamation from end to end. Yes, but listen, all that you see is I. You have festivities, they are my laugh. You have public rejoicings, they are my laugh. You have marriages, consecrations, coronations, they are my laugh. You have births of princes, they are my laugh. You have the thunder above you, it's my laugh. This expresses his understanding of the meaning of that laugh. The mask of laughter is degradation, dehumanization. He's a walking illustration of, as he says, humanity as its masters have made it. What has been done to me has been done to the human race. They have deformed its right, justice, truth, reason, intelligence as they have my eyes, nostrils, and ears. It's very colorful, exciting, dramatic story. Takes us from the shipwreck of an international gang of criminals to the House of Lords, from the London docks to Queen Anne's palace, from hell to heaven and back again. And from the beginning of the narrative to its conclusion, we've got the tempests in the mind of Gwynplaine. We see him when he's a child, alone and in physical danger. Instead of surrendering to death, he chooses life, and his heroism is rewarded. And at the end, after risking the loss of all that made life meaningful, he again makes a heroic choice and is again rewarded, for error is not, in fact, final. After rejecting the temptations of a false happiness and a false identity, he regains forever his true spiritual paradise. Now, the novel is haunted by tragedy, as was Hugo himself. During the writing of the novel, one of his grandchildren died, as did his wife Adele, far away from him. But that all becomes part of the emotion. It is brilliant, inventive, and original, so read it. Now, in 1870, the year after The Man Who Laughs, he agreed to go back to France, where Napoleon III had been removed from power, but it was not exactly a good time for him. He later wrote about it, he called it the terrible year. His son Charles died of a stroke, and so did Charles's wife. And then the Paris Commune uprising of May 1871 was a violent event that filled him with sorrow and disillusionment. And he wrote several poems, but I'm going to tell you about one of them, called À qui la faute? Whose Fault Is It? Which was published in L'année terrible, the terrible year. And it's about the insurgents who had vandalized many buildings, including a library. And the main speaker criticizes that revolutionary and says, "This is your treasure, your dowry, your heritage. When a book gleams and sheds light, away with famine. When it speaks, away with slavery. It would cure your hatred and remove your delirium. Look what you have lost, and by your fault. A book is riches, knowledge, truth, virtue, progress, reason, making the madness melt away, and you have destroyed that, you." The revolutionary replies with just a few words, "Je ne sais pas lire. I don't know how to read." And that's it. I don't know how to read. So doesn't even know what he's been destroying. Well, Victor Hugo left France again, returned to Guernsey to write 93, set during the French Civil War, 1793, when the royalists in a part of France known as the Vendée joined with the peasants to fight against the last gasp. They were the last fighters against the French Revolution. And in this tightly plotted novel, there is a conflict between a brave, strong aristocrat and his brave, strong relative, who's on the other side, a revolutionary soldier, who was loved and worshipped by a brave, strong former priest. You see a theme here. All the characters and all roads meet when the aristocrat sets on fire the stronghold where he's deposited 3 children who've been tracked through France by their brave, strong mother. The book is suspenseful, poignant, tragic, and inspiring. I've done a course on it. You need to read it. Not read my course, but you need to read the book. Read this book too. Well, After this novel, he continued to write poems and essays, not all of which he published in his lifetime, but all of which were left as a legacy to the nation. And there were more than 1 million people at his funeral, and when he died, the world mourned. But for some of his readers, he lives forever. So, impact. His impact, so I've kind of gone through his life probably too quickly, but I want to tell you something about his impact, and then we'll have questions. He was read all over the world in a variety of circumstances. During the American Civil War, for example, he was well known, well esteemed, and frequently quoted. The soldiers of the Confederate Army were referred to as Lee's Miserables, and people knew what the joke meant. Great writers, too, paid attention to him and his writing. I am thinking, for example, of his impact on another ambitious writer, a Russian, a passionate moralist, the author of fiction, drama, and nonfiction, and someone who, like Victor Hugo, wrote very long books. But you've already figured it out. I am talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky, right? Okay, Dostoevsky. Okay, even during literary censorship, Hugo was published in Russia, and of all the French writers, he was the one most read in Russia. And I could say a lot about him because he had a lot to say about Hugo, and he loved Hugo passionately. On the day that he thought he was going to be executed, killed, he was thinking of Hugo. When he returned to Petersburg after 10 years of prison and exile, he founded the journal Vremya, and in its first issue, he wrote about Hugo. When he and a friend took a trip abroad, they spent their time in Florence, reading 3 or 4 volumes of Les Miserables. A few months later, he publishes a Russian translation of Notre and articulates what he saw as Hugo's idea, the basic idea, основная мысль for all art of the 19th century, the rehabilitation of the fallen man crushed by injustice. He really loved Les Miserables. In January 1863, he begged a friend, "Wouldn't you let me have, for heaven's sake, Les Miserables for no more than 1 or 2 days? If not all of it, at least the beginning. If not the beginning, the middle will do, or any part. If not in French, at least in any Russian translation, I need it. I'm writing something." It's not clear what he might have been writing at that time, but he did begin work on Crime and Punishment within 2 years. And Crime and Punishment is in part an answer to Les Miserables, which I could tell you a lot about. The short version is that he's reinvented some of the characters and he has altered the theme because in Les Miserables, it's important to think. Gets you, that's what gets, Enjolras is a thinker and Jean Valjean needs to think. And in Crime and Punishment, thinking too much can kill you. But if you want to know more about that, I can tell you. But that was his answer to Les Miserables, but that was not the end of it. His second wife reports reading Les Miserables with him during the early months of their marriage and their travel abroad. 7 years later, she says, he reread the book while in jail for a minor censorship difficulty and wrote, "How good it is that I was locked up. Otherwise, I would never have had the time to recall the former wonderful impressions made on me by this masterpiece." All right, so you understand, he reads Hugo on his honeymoon and in jail. So he loved Hugo. Not everyone agreed. Some writers didn't even like him. Gustave Flaubert, a French contemporary, admired Hugo's poetry and said, "He's one of those men before whom one must bow and say, 'After you, monsieur.'" But that was the poetry. When it came to Les Miserables, Flaubert said, "It was made for the socio-Catholic riffraff, the whole philosophico-evangelical vermin. I find neither truth nor goodness in this book. As for the style, it seems to me intentionally incorrect and base. The characters are little men made of sugar. This book is decidedly childish." All right, I'll tell you. He had his own book that was ready to go, and he slowed down. He had them wait to publish it because it was clear that in the spring of 1862, no one was going to be reading anything but Les Miserables. So his own book, he took out of competition. Just saying. Okay, then there's Ionesco, 20th century playwright, known for the theater of the absurd. And at the age of 26, he wrote a mock biography of Hugo, and he called it Hugoliade. Now, it was mock, not only in that it was not a serious attempt to recount the important facts about Hugo's life and work, but that his purpose seems to have been to expose Hugo's weakness of talent and defects of character. And he mocks not only Hugo, but the worldwide audience that loved his work. Here are a few quotations from an English translation, not mine. But it's his words as translated. "Victor Hugo was esteemed by the semi-educated amorphous mass that constituted the Romantic public. Hugo, moralist, of the commonplace became the sole guide, the ultimate standard of wisdom for a public fascinated by precisely the consecration of platitudes. Victor Hugo never took the trouble to think. He was a man of exemplary mediocrity. But you understand, they're wrong. You can see it. To see that they're wrong, you just need to open your eyes, open the door to the books that have come for you and that say, all rise. Because you remember Hugo's poem about the library, the burning of the library. The revolutionary who burns it down, who's obliterating the books of irreplaceable value, is a man who doesn't know how to read. Well, we all need to know how to read. And we need to follow through and to perform the task of reading. And when we do, we respond to his invitation. And now, a few more words from someone who appreciated, and it's not Ayn Rand, but it's Mario Vargas Llosa again, and he talks about the power of Les Miserables. He says, it can convince us that its adventures, its larger-than-life characters, are indeed true human reality, a reality that is both possible and achievable. It can convince us that this reality has been stolen from us by bad governments and the evil arts of evil men who hold power on earth and exploit and dominate society. But reading gives us access to this lost reality and spurs us on to recover and reinstate it through our actions. And he adds, in the history of literature, Les Miserables is one of the works that has been most influential in making so many men and women of all languages and culture desire a more just, rational, and beautiful world than the one they live in. So, spoken today about his life and his works and his impact, that was my assignment. Describe chief events of his life and the range of his writings and impact. I hope I provide some incentive for you to read or reread or both the writings of Victor Hugo. I recommend, of course, that you read what Ayn Rand has written about The Man Who Laughs in 93 and her analysis in The Art of Fiction of Hugo's style in Notre Dame de Paris. And I recommend my own articles and courses, which I listed on the handout. And I'd also like to recommend Lisa Van Dam's Read With Me program on Facebook and in the app as a sensitive, insightful guide to two of his novels, Notre Dame of Paris in 93. And in her talk, she's going to be featuring characters from both of those novels. So today, I brought you a pebble from the mountain. And I do, of course, have more to say, but I want to give you a chance to ask some questions before we reach the end. But I got to remind you once again that Hugo told us that his book is knocking on the door. It's come for you, and you can read it. Activate your mind. Open the door. It's worth it. There's a scene I've always loved in Alan Bennett's play The History Boys from 2004. Douglas Hector, a passionate teacher in a British secondary school, is in a tutorial with a student. They're reading poetry. And the teacher talks about the experience of finding oneself in literature. You come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things that you thought special, particular to you. And here it is, set down by someone else, a person you've never met, maybe even someone lying dead. And it's as if a hand has come out and taken yours. Well, when the hand comes out, you seize it and hold on and don't let it go. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for that talk. Among the things that he bequeathed to France, were there the letters from Juliet, and are they worthy of their recipient?
Okay, you're asking about you mean Juliet's letters to him. Well, I've not read all of them. I've read some of them, and there's a book called something like Letters to Toto, which was a nickname for him, and that's in English. So I guess maybe I would say that she appreciated him, and I don't think that she just, and she had to put up with a lot. And yet it was, I think, it seems to have been more things than I told you about. That it was worth it to her. I think that she thought that he was great, and that she herself could do what I do. She could appreciate greatness, and that she could be a friend to the greatness in him. And I think that's a reason why their connection endured for such a long time. Thanks for the question. Yes?
Thank you for helping me understand how and why Hugo has inspired so many people. Can you tell us anything about who inspired Hugo? Or at least who did he admire?
Okay, you're asking about inspirations on Hugo. Well, he did admire at least the career and the writing of the writer Chateaubriand. And one of the things that he said for himself when he was starting out on his career, he says, either Chateaubriand or nothing. Okay, he aspired to be like that. I think he looked at other writers as writers who had talent, but that he was going to do better. That was good, but hang in there. I'll do better. And I think he liked Scott. It just, Scott was, I guess, what Ayn Rand would have properly called, naturalistic, but nonetheless, interesting stories and some interesting characters. So that was, and he, of course, he read the great French tragedies, and those writers knew how to write French, and he would, and to structure a play. I mean, he didn't change the structure of the play, but I think that he himself, well, I guess I should mention Shakespeare, because, he wrote a book about Shakespeare, but it wasn't really a book about Shakespeare. It was a book in which he explained his ideas, and people said that he really should have called it Moi, because it was more about him. But I think Shakespeare was a writer whom he admired, and Shakespeare, especially the tragedies and the history plays. That was not so much the comedies, and he himself was not so much for the comedies. So I guess those would be a few of his favorites.
Thank you.
But I think that he probably wouldn't want to say inspired by. He's inspired. He carries his own inspiration with him. Yes.
Toilers of the Sea.
Yes.
A bit of a spoiler alert if you've not read it. All you say is true. I mean, the hero, he has all these great abilities, he struggles, he strives, he wins. But I find it overall malevolent, because he does all this. Then at the end, his entire goal for doing it, he fails dismally. So how do you relate that to all the rest you say about it? I mean, Ayn Rand obviously admired his work, and it's heroic and so. It's like, Atlas Shrugged happening and Galt getting killed or something. I don't find it very inspiring in that sense, in this great tragic endings.
Okay. Well, I think you're asking a question that sort of has a short part and a long part, and part of it has to do with the particular ending of Toilers of the Sea, and the other, which is related, is why is there tragedy? And I'm going to give you short answers for both of those, but I wrote up 4 pages in case I didn't get any questions, and I just got that one, and I talk about tragedy. So maybe I'll say something about that first. The issue with what Hugo has tragic endings, you might have noticed that the best characters, they're the ones who die. Okay? And he doesn't view that as a punishment for them. There are things worse than death. And the B team, the more ordinary characters, they're the ones who live on. And so part of what happens when a character dies, including Gilliatt, is that, well, his story is over, he ended it on the height. Aristotle, when do you know that a man is happy? When he gets to the end? Well, they get to the end and they're happy and they're great, and that's the way it's supposed to be. He really admires Gilliatt as he admires other characters who die, and the ones who survive are somewhat lesser. And that's Hugo's view of the world. And there are worse things than death. I mean, there is disillusionment, there's degradation, there's not living up to your best self, and none of those things are ever going to happen to Gilliatt. Now, when we talk about Gilliatt, there I actually wrote something on that subject, and I wrote it the way that I did to not be a spoiler, and I was asked to do an introduction for Toilers of the Sea, and I said, well, I really want to do a sandwich. I want to do an introduction before people read the book, and then an afterward to help when they're unhappy about the way that it ended, and just sort of to give some perspective. And I said a few things there, which maybe you could, one of them I think especially stands out for me. What was there, for an Ayn Rand character, there would be a future afterwards, but for him, that woman that he did it all for, little cupcake, she's not a deep person, she's not in love with him. Why should he live his life with her? Not to mention the whole community. This is not a good place for him. Now, of course, he ought to take his boat and go to the United States and have a great life there and invent things and build things. But that wasn't the novel Hugo was writing. The possibility of staying there with her would not have been a good life for him. That would not have been a heroic, that would have been an anticlimax for that hero. So instead, he recognizes that she is not what he thought she was. He recognizes, now, if he had saved that engine and then it landed back in the sea again, so it's all lost, that'd be bad. But no, he did what he went to do. She wasn't worth it. And that's clear to us, and he doesn't have to say it because that would be mean. Okay, that she's, when she sees him, she faints. I mean, what is that? But he chooses, he goes on his own strike. He's not having this. He's out of here. He doesn't want any of the futures he sees available to him. So that's Juliet's story, I think. I never talked to Victor Hugo about it, and I know, he did do some of that table turning stuff. So, but apparently when the spirits came to visit when he did the seances, they always seemed to speak like Victor Hugo. What's that about? But so he didn't deal directly with that question of why all the tragic endings. But I think if you come back to the fact that who were the most splendid characters, the consistent ones, even the life-loving ones, it's as if they've got a different way of life now. But it's not the conventional way. So I think that's what's going on in Toilers and in actually all the others. Unfortunately, in his own life, he lived past 80. Good. I wouldn't want him to check out any sooner. But in his fiction, it's almost as if he rewards the heroic characters with an often chosen, willed, now, death. That's not Ayn Rand's way, but that was his way. So that's what I think. Okay. Another question.
I have a couple of recommendations. I'm not sure the extent to which you'll agree with them, but they're not on your outline, but you sort of alluded to them. So if you want to comment on them further, one way or the other, that would be great. And then I have a question, but maybe I'll get in the back of the line after my recommendations, and if there's time, we can get to that. But so the first one is sort of related to Lisa's question about the love letters to Victor Hugo. You can get a book of the love letters from Victor Hugo to his wife Adele during their courtship, which you mentioned in the talk that he wrote a lot of love letters to her, and I think a lot of them are extremely beautiful and worth reading. And I think the book as a whole is worth reading to kind of get a window into the soul of the young Victor Hugo. So yeah, if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I think that's worth reading. What I put here was certainly not all the things I've read, but books that I used as sources and sources on Rand's writing and my writing. But
Okay.
Sure, I think that's great. I think, she wrote sort of a biography of him. That's also interesting. That's her perspective. So that's a good recommendation. What else?
Okay, and the other one was, you mentioned that he was a visual artist as well as a writer. And his visual art is very interesting. It's, very new and different, kind of modern and ahead of its time in a lot of ways, like his writing was, kind of maybe for better and for worse in some ways. But you mentioned he did thousands and thousands, many thousands of drawings. Most of them are ink sketches, and some of them are illustrations for his own novels and things. And so you can get editions of Toilers of the Sea that have his own illustrations for them and his drawings of the devilfish and things like that. So I think that's worth looking at for people who are interested in that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of the drawings are up online. Yeah. I think maybe over at the Bibliothèque Nationale, something like that. I know I've found them. And yeah, they're very interesting. And that was another way his imagination worked. And since you mentioned the handout and you mentioned visuals, I'll just mention something. I don't know if anyone's going to ask me. On the back here, you see this? This is from a comic book version of Les Miserables. And the artist of this comic book version is René Giffey. René Giffey was the illustrator of La Vallée Mystérieuse, The Mysterious Valley, the book that inspired Ayn Rand and gave her first image of a hero. So I guess you could say that the same illustrator, did this and did The Mysterious Valley. And I looked in here to see if Enjolras looked like Cyrus from The Mysterious Valley, and there's a little resemblance. Cyrus is better looking. But still, I thought it was interesting that that Giffey had done this. That's Giffey, Renee Giffey.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. One of the works of Hugo that I find very moving is The Last Day of a Condemned Man.
Yes.
And I would like to know if that kind of advocacy for a social cause or a political cause was distinctive to Hugo, or that's distinctive to the era itself.
Okay, well, there were plenty of people who were enemies of capital punishment, but that he chose to write it in the form of the thoughts of the condemned man, one. Two, he focused on that person's experience. We don't even know what the guy was condemned for, so he's isolated that out. And it's very moving, and it apparently was effective. And I'll tell you something else. That was a piece of writing that made a big impression on Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky, in his introduction to a story of his called Krotka, A Gentle Creature, he wrote, "I am here using the approach that Victor Hugo used in Danger d'un condamné à mort." So yeah, that's great work.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious if you know what language Ayn Rand read Hugo in, and if you have a preferred English translation for some of Hugo's works.
Okay, of course Ayn Rand read him in French. And she was horrified when she saw that other people were reading English translations, that they weren't as good. And you probably know this. Well, for one thing, we know that she read him in French because she could read French very well. She read French earlier and better than she read English when she was in Russia. And she first actually heard 93 read aloud before she read it. And then later she found it, she read it. So definitely in French. And she owned copies in French. And when someone who was apparently not enjoying a translation said to her, "Oh, what's all the fuss about?" And she said, "Oh, you need to know the way Hugo really wrote." And she sat down with The Man Who Laughs and started translating. I got 30, 40 pages in, so I would love my favorite. Okay, that's a good answer. My favorite English translation of Victor Hugo is Ayn Rand. Okay, yeah, good. As far as what to recommend to other people to read, I always have a little trouble in that because myself, when I'm getting ready to think about it, I do read it in French. If I'm getting ready to teach, I look to see what's in print and what's complete. I would recommend, even if you yourself are going to choose to skip things, that you buy something that's complete. And I think that the Charles Wilbur translation, edited by Feinstock, the one that's in the Signet great big paperback with the cover that looks like Les Miserables musical, that looks pretty good to me. I mean, that's the one I've used for a lot of years. And there might be a newer one, but I have not made it my task to keep looking and to judge. I think I wrote down which translations I was drawing on for when I read from the novels, because I was using other people's translations. And for the poetry, I was using my own. But just try to make it complete. And of course, you can always learn to read French. If you're young and want to. That's actually how I learned to read both Hugo and French, is that I was away from home for some period of time, and I took with me only the novels of Victor Hugo so that I would not be tempted to read anything else. And by the time I got done with those novels in French, I could read French. I'd studied it in school, but, I'd read I was motivated and I'd read all of that. And there were notes because he makes up some words, but it's wonderful French. It's almost worth learning French to read him in French.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious. Hugo saw the Thénardiers as the truly evil characters.
Oh, yes.
But I was curious what you thought about the musical depiction, which they're almost just like comic relief.
Mm-hmm.
And I just was curious what you thought about the adaptations of his work.
Okay, that's a good question, because it's one of the reasons why one form is going to make changes. I believe that the people doing the musical thought that a change of mood was necessary, and you're watching it all at once. And if the intensity gets too much when you're reading, you can put the book down and go for a walk. You don't need to have the characters turn into people they aren't. My impression when I first saw it was that it disappointed me because they're evil and they were funny. And so it was almost as if they were visiting from a Dickens novel where some of the rogues are funny. Dickens and Hugo also are kind of interesting to look at together. So I thought that was unfortunate, but it's a different work. Okay, I mean, it's still called Les Miserables, it's got the same names of the characters, but that's certainly, those characters are comic and, in a sense, ordinary rather than vicious, which means that it's a simpler world, the world of the musical than Hugo's world, which does have those evil people in it. And you know what happens to Thénardier at the end? Remember? He goes off to America to own slaves. Yeah. More trouble, right? But, well, and again, part of a systematic form of evil. So, yeah, I think that's too bad. But I like many things about the musical. And, I like the use of themes. I've seen some wonderful performances. And I like, I guess, the seriousness of it, even though the Thénardiers are the comic relief. I think it's serious. It doesn't make fun of heroism. I like that. Okay, got another. There you go again.
All right. So my question, you gave us some examples about how Hugo is a very polarizing figure, in terms of subsequent literary criticism, or even, I guess, among his contemporaries. And, he's very controversial at the time. With Hernani, you talked about how new it was, both in terms of content and style. And, the reaction to it, the Battle of Hernani. And I've read that, and I can't remember where this comes from, but, some kind of literary historians consider Hernani to be sort of the birth of Romanticism and drama as against classicism, like a real break from the past. And on the other extreme, and you said, even his critics have to acknowledge his greatness, but in some respects, but they can also be very vicious in their criticism. And I can't remember if this comes from Ionesco or somebody like George Bernard Shaw or somebody, but I seem to recall that somebody described him as an idiot savant in terms of, he obviously had this prodigious literary output, but that he was basically an intellectual moron. So I guess my question is, it's pretty obvious, like, which side you come down on.
Yeah. Well, I'm on the right side.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. But so I guess, can you say a little bit more about his place in literary history and, and how he's how influential he's been on kind of the subsequent developments and any further elaboration you want to make on that?
Okay. Well, I think that there are sort of two parts to your question. One is that some people don't appreciate his writing, and I've always thought that tells you more about them. He's not the only one for whom that applies, right? However, I think that it is true that some of the changes in style, you probably know this, that in that poem that he wrote about, and he says, well, what did I do? I had a king ask what time it is, as if that's too mundane. Well, kings have been asking what time it is since then. And so it was as if certain kinds of rigid rules went away. He himself did not use the word romantic to apply to himself, but I think that he was nonetheless, well, if you were a romantic, wouldn't you want Hugo to be your champion and your initiator? What I think is true is that it's possible to parody him. It's not that easy to actually live up to him. Mm-hmm. And so he doesn't have imitators in the usual sense. That's my view. I'm thinking of other writers afterwards and not being quite like him. However, you don't have to write like Hugo in order to appreciate him, and I think that his reputation among the world readership, he doesn't go away. Some people still do read, they pick up a book and, oh, that's better than I thought. Oh, I couldn't forget that book. Nothing was more important to me that week than reading that book. And maybe that'll happen for you. And I'm going to give you my last words now.
Thank you.
Okay, it's all right. All right. In his introduction to Les Contemplations, a collection of poems, Hugo acknowledges that some readers complain when a writer speaks of himself and not of them. And he says, when I tell you about myself, I am speaking of you. How can you not sense this? He speaks to us and of us. And we are here in Cleveland because of Ayn Rand, and so I am going to close with one of my favorite lines from Atlas Shrugged. It's from part 3, chapter 7, and the chapter is called This is John Galt Speaking, and these are the words. Whoever you are, you who are alone with my words in this moment, with nothing but your honesty to help you understand. Well, that's all there is. Every reader, every listener, every thinker, alone with the words, with nothing but honesty to help them understand. And as the speaker says there, the choice is still open, and the choice is open here to be Hugo's thinking reader, to understand and to experience what he's given us. You know, he's worth it. It's worth it. And so are you. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. To help keep content like this free, consider supporting ARI by becoming a member at aynrand.org/membership.